appraisals, doctored loan documentation, and other fraudulent activity. In 2005, the IMF's chief economist, Raghuram Rajan, warned that dangerous incentives could lead to a crisis. Then came Nouriel Roubini's warnings in 2006, Alan Sloan's articles in Fortune magazine and the Washington Post in 2007, and repeated warnings from the IMF.
I say that on behalf of the institution, the crisis which is in front of us is a huge crisis.
Who did you talk to?
Government, Treasury, Fed, everybody.
In May of 2007, hedge fund manager Bill Ackman circulated a presentation called Who's Holding the Bag, which described how the bubble would unravel. And in early 2008, Charles Morris published his book about the impending crisis.
You're just not sure what to do. And you might have some suspicions that underwriting standards are being weakened, but then the question is, should you do anything about it?
By 2008, home foreclosures were skyrocketing, and the securitization food chain imploded. Lenders could no longer sell their loans to the investment banks, and as the loans went bad, dozens of lenders failed.
Chuck Prince of Citibank famously said that we have to dance until the music stops. Actually, the music has stopped already when he said that.
The market for CDOs collapsed, leaving the investment banks holding hundreds of billions of dollars in loans, CDOs, and real estate they couldn't sell.
When the crisis started, both the Bush administration and the Federal Reserve were totally behind the curve. They did not understand the extent of it.
At what point do you remember thinking for the first time, this is dangerous, this is bad?
I remember very well I think it was a G7 meeting of February 2008, and I remember discussing the issue with Hank Paulson, and I clearly remember telling Hank, we are watching this tsunami coming, and you just proposing that we ask which swimming costume we're going to put on.
What was his response? What was his feeling?
Things are pretty much under control. Yes, we are looking at this situation carefully, and yeah, it's under control.
We're going to keep growing, okay? And obviously, I'll say it, if you keep
when will it happen
growing,
again?
you're not in recession.
Because right now, guess what?
We all know that.
Credit card debt, all-time high. If you didn't know. America's debt, all-time high, if you didn't know.
In a matter of days, one of the pillars of Wall Street...
In March of 2008, the investment bank Bear Stearns ran out of cash and was acquired for $2 a share by J.P. Morgan Chase. The deal was backed by $30 billion in emergency guarantees from the Federal Reserve.
That was the time when the administration could have come in and put in place, various kinds of measures that would have reduced system risk.
The information I'm receiving from some entities is the end is not here, that there are other shoes to fall.
I've seen those investment banks working with the Fed and the SEC strengthen their liquidity, strengthen their capital positions. I get reports all the time. Our regulators are very vigilant.
On September 7th, 2008, Henry Paulson announced the federal takeover of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two giant mortgage lenders on the brink of collapse.
Nothing about our actions today in any way reflects a changed view of the housing correction or the strength of other U.S. financial institutions.
2 days later, Lehman Brothers announced record losses of $3.2 billion, and its stock collapsed.
The effects of Lehman and AIG in September still came as a surprise. I mean, this is even after July and Fannie and Freddie. So clearly there was stuff that as of September, major stuff that nobody knew about.
I think that's fair.
Bear Stearns was rated AAA like a month before it went bankrupt.
Likely A2.
A2.
Yeah.
Okay. Bear Stearns
A2 is
rated
No.
A2 right before
That's
they
high
went
investment
bankrupt.
grade.
That's like one of that solid rating.
A2 within days of failing. AIG AA within days of being bailed out. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were AAA when they were rescued.
Citigroup, Merrill, all of them had investment grade ratings.
How can that be?
Well, that's a good question. That's a great question.
At no point did the administration ever go to all the major institutions and say, this is serious. Tell us what your positions are. No bullshit. Where are you?
Well, first, that's what the regulators, it's their job, right? Their job is to understand the exposure across these different institutions, and they have a very refined understanding that I think became more refined as the crisis proceeded. So,
forgive me, but that's clearly not true. I mean,
what do you mean it's not true?
In August of 2008, were you aware of the credit ratings held then by Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, AIG, and did you think that they were accurate?
Well, certainly by that time, it was always clear that earlier credit ratings weren't accurate because they had been downgraded substantially.
No, they hadn't.
There was still some downgrading in terms of the industry concerns, and certainly the stock price.
All those firms were rated
Stop
at
lying.
least A2 until
Triple
a couple of days before they
Fannie Mae,
Well,
Freddie Mac.
then the answer is I just don't know enough to really answer your question on this particular issue.
Governor Fred Mishkin is resigning effective August 31.
Maria.
He says he plans to return to his teaching post at Columbia's Graduate School of Business.
Why did you leave the Federal Reserve in August of 2008, in the middle of the worst financial crisis?
So I had to revise a textbook.
His departure leaves the Fed board with 3 of its 7 seats vacant, just when the economy needs it most.
Well, I'm sure your textbook is important and widely read, but in August of 2008, some somewhat more important things were going on in the world, don't you think?
By Friday, September 12th, Lehman Brothers had run out of cash, and the entire investment banking industry was sinking fast. The stability of the global financial system was in jeopardy. That weekend, Henry Paulson and Timothy Geithner, president of the New York Federal Reserve, called an emergency meeting with the CEOs of the major banks in an effort to rescue Lehman.
I remember that. Top
But
funds.
Lehman wasn't alone. Merrill Lynch, another major investment bank, was also on the brink of failure. And that Sunday, it was acquired by Bank of America. The only bank interested in buying Lehman was the British firm Barclays. But British regulators demanded a financial guarantee from the US government. Paulson refused.
We all jumped into a yellow cab and went down to the Federal Reserve Bank. They wanted the bankruptcy case commenced before midnight of September 14th. We kept pressing that this would be a terrible event. And at some point, I used the word Armageddon, and they fully considered the consequences of what they were proposing. The effect on the market would be extraordinary.
You said this.
Yes. They just said they had considered all of the comments that we had made, and they were still of the belief that in order to calm the markets and move forward, it was necessary for Lehman to go into bankruptcy.
Calm the markets. When were you first told that Lehman, in fact, was going to go bankrupt?
After the fact.
After the fact. Wow. Okay. And what was your reaction when you learned of it?
Holy cow.
Paulson and Bernanke had not consulted with other governments and didn't understand the consequences of foreign bankruptcy laws.
Lehman Brothers London continued to empty their
Under British law, Lehman's London office had to be closed immediately.
All transactions came to a halt, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of transactions.
The hedge funds who had assets with Lehman in London discovered overnight, to their complete horror, that they couldn't get those assets back.
One of the points of the hub failed, and that had huge knock-on effects around the system.
The oldest money market fund in the nation wrote off roughly $750 million in bad debt issued by the now bankrupt Lehman Brothers.
Lehman's failure also caused a collapse in the commercial paper market, which many companies depend on to pay for operating expenses such as payroll.
That means maybe they have to lay off employees. They can't buy parts. It stops business in its tracks.
Suddenly, people stood and said, listen, what can we believe in? There's nothing we can trust anymore.
That same week, AIG owed $13 billion to holders of credit default swaps. and it didn't have the money.
AIG was another hub. If AIG had stopped, all planes may have to be, stop flying.
On September 17th, AIG is taken over by the government. And one day later, Paulson and Bernanke asked Congress for $700 billion to bail out the banks.
Coming together.
They warned that the alternative would be a catastrophic financial collapse.
It was scary, the entire system froze up. Every part of the financial system, every part of the credit system, nobody could borrow money. There was like a cardiac arrest of the global financial system.
I'm playing the hand that was dealt me. A lot of what I'm dealing with, I'm dealing with the consequences of things that were done often many years ago.
Secretary Paulson spoke throughout the fall and all the potential root causes of this, and there are plenty. He called him. So I'm not sure.
You're not being serious about that,
I
right?
am being serious. What would you have expected? What were you looking for that you didn't see?
He was the senior advocate for prohibiting the regulation of credit default swaps and also lifting the leverage limits on the investment banks.
So again, what
he mentioned those things? I never heard him mention those things.
Could we turn this off for a second?
Yo, Paulson's slick though.
When AIG was bailed out, the owners of its credit default swaps, the most prominent of which was Goldman Sachs, were paid $61 billion the next day. Paulson, Bernanke, and Tim Geithner forced AIG to pay 100 cents on the dollar rather than negotiate lower prices. Eventually, the AIG bailout cost taxpayers over $150 billion.
$160 billion went through AIG, $14 billion went to Goldman Sachs.
At the same time, Paulson and Geithner forced AIG to surrender its right to sue Goldman and the other banks for fraud.
Isn't there a problem when the person in charge of dealing with this crisis is the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, someone who had a major role in causing it?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the financial markets today are incredibly complicated.
The supply urgently needed money.
On October 4th, 2008, President Bush
October
signs a
4th, 2008.
bailout.
I remember that October 2008
But world stock
crash.
markets continue to fall amid
Holy
fears
shit.
that a global recession is now underway.
October 2008 crash.
The bailout legislation does nothing to stem the tide of layoffs and foreclosures. Unemployment in the United States and Europe quickly rises to 10%. The recession accelerates and spreads globally.
I began to get really scared because I hadn't foreseen the whole world going down at the same rate.